For this part of the lecture, we'll be talking about detecting hidden prejudices, or prejudice. So first of all, why would prejudice be hidden? Well, there are lots of reasons for this ultimately. One of probably the most common is that in many places, at least in this country, it is considered to be socially unacceptable to openly express one's prejudicial attitudes. And thus, in accordance with social norms, people do not express their prejudicial attitudes and thus keep them hidden. Another reason why a person might want to hide their attitudes is that they are, one, recognizing that they hold prejudicial attitudes and would no longer like to endorse those attitudes, and thus they will try and suppress those attitudes in an effort to get rid of those prejudicial attitudes. A third reason that people might not consciously endorse these prejudices is because they are simply unaware that they hold those types of biases. And while this might be strange to think about, at the end of the day, a lot of human beings have all manner of different types of associations that make them like and dislike things, anywhere from people to just random objects, that they don't actually consciously know why they like one class over another, and those are ultimately an example of just implicit attitudes or associations. Now, one way that is commonly used to evaluate this type of hidden prejudice, at least in the job market, is by sending manipulated resumes to a wide variety of different job openings. And so what will happen in these types of studies is people will create identical resumes as far as qualifications and interests and stuff like that go, and then they'll only change things like the name, where the name gives hints at the gender of the person or what ethnic background they come from or their race, stuff like this, or where they'll change just like the age of the person who is applying to the job. And then they will look at how many callbacks do they get based on these resumes. And note that they send each version of a resume to each of these jobs in a lot of cases. Maybe not always at the exact same time though. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, we still find large discrepancies in the number of callbacks based on the type of individuals represented in these resumes. Another interesting thing that is mentioned in your textbook is that a lot of jobs now actually look at people's social media and make judgments about those people based on information that they were not legally allowed to ask people for when they come in for interviews. And so some experimenters actually went so far as to not only create fabricated resumes, but to create entire fictional Facebook accounts for those resumes. And by manipulating the qualities of those Facebook accounts, like what it says about a person, like where they're from, what their sexual orientation is, their gender, things like that, that they actually find systematic biases in the callbacks received, even though, again, these resumes and the qualifications within them are identical. Another fun way that people have used to sort of get at these hidden prejudices was something called Bogus Pipeline. This was used largely in the 70s and 80s, though I have not seen it really in any modern literature. So I'm not sure if it's still something that is used, but maybe in its place you could use a polygraph if you wanted to go about this type of procedure. The way it works is that you hook people up to like a really complicated looking machine. The more complicated, the better. So like screens and lights and beeps and wires and all that kind of stuff. And you hook it up to the people, right, probably with like electrodes or a cap or something like that. And you tell them that this machine is able to detect when a person is lying about their sort of infelt deep down attitudes. Now, it is important to note that the machine doesn't actually do anything. It's just a complex prop, right? Like imagine the background of Star Trek, right? It's just a total big thing with lots of blinking lights, but doesn't actually do anything. Now, reliably and consistently, when people are hooked up to a machine like this and given a questionnaire about their prejudicial attitudes, they will report higher degrees of prejudice than a control group who's answering exactly the same questions but not hooked up to that machine. And the thinking here is that people don't think on average that they can beat a machine in many things, especially when they're told that these machines are designed for a specific function, because that's one of the stereotypes that human beings have about machines. It's like oftentimes people will trust calculators over human beings, even though it's easy to make order of operation errors in a calculator. And then they will doubt their own sort of intuitive feelings about correctness and not. And so this has been, again, another way that people have found to get at these hidden prejudices. But note that both of these two things ultimately they require at least a person to have some degree of awareness of those prejudices that they have themselves because of the actions that they are taking. But when it comes to attitudes that people cannot consciously endorse, we oftentimes use something called the implicit association test, which is a more modern test that is now quite widely used to measure hidden prejudice. So the way it works is it's designed to measure the difference in response speed that people have in associating positive and negative words to some particular target group. So a more concrete example would be, so imagine if we're just considering gender to be binary of men and women, which it's not really, but for the case of this example. And so what you do is you have photos of men and women, and you organize them into two categories. You put men on one side, and you put women on the other side, and you push two buttons on a keyboard to make that sorting. So after you've done that a bunch for pictures of men and women, then the next chunk starts, and there you sort positive and negative words. So stuff like awful and happy. And you again sort these into two different categories on either side of the screen with a keyboard. Then it gets a little bit more complicated. So now you have sort of like a conjunction sorting process that starts. So on the first block, let's say you now have to sort women and positive words that are showing up in a mixed order into one category and negative words and men into a different category. And so basically you have two different things that can go into one and two different things that can go into the other. And again, people's response times are measured. Now, after they've done that a bunch of times, the pairing is switched. So if you were doing women and positive words and men and negative words, now the order will be the other way around, where you're sorting women and negative words into one side and positive words and men onto the other. Now, the difference in response times across these two specific conjunction sorting blocks is what is used to measure implicit bias. So for example, if I can sort men and positive words faster than I can sort men and negative words, or if I could sort women and negative words faster than I could sort women and positive words, this would be used to index that I have a bias towards women. Now, it is not limited to gender. If you go onto the IAT site out of Harvard, I believe it comes from originally, you can find IATs in all different forms. Things for race, for age, for gender, even for things like education and social status. That being said, there are still some questions about the validity of the IAT, even though it is incredibly widely used in prejudice literature today. Now, some studies have indeed shown that there is a positive relationship between IAT scores and people's actual prejudicial behavior. By that, I just mean that people who score highly in bias on the IAT also tend to have higher degrees of prejudicial behavior. That being said, the majority of the literature indicates that this relationship is ultimately relatively weak at best. What we mean by that this relationship is weak is not that they don't allow us to predict one from the other, but rather that when we are predicting, let's say, prejudice based on IAT scores, there is quite a high degree of error in those predictions. And ultimately, when we're talking about relationships in an empirical or statistical sense, the stronger the relationship that we can measure, the more accurate our predictions will be. It's not to say that the relationship is not important if it's weak, it's just a matter of how accurately we can predict things. And a lot of times when we're measuring things like prejudice using tools like the IAT, the ultimate goal isn't to just be like, haha, you're prejudiced and haha, you're not. It's to be able to say, okay, let us be able to use this diagnostic tool to predict where prejudicial actions are likely to happen. And for that, it isn't the most valid in that regard. In fact, this has led many psychologists to think that the IAT does not actually index an individual's bias, but rather it is measuring the cultural associations and stereotypes that those individuals grew up in. This is why a lot of people ultimately get very surprised by this, but some of the most common ones are, say you give an African American who grew up in the United States the IAT, and they're doing a race IAT between white and black people. Many of them will actually show an implicit bias against African American people who are their own group. And this is often very surprising to people because they'll come away and be like, wait a second, am I prejudiced towards my own people? Even though their behaviors don't necessarily show any of those prejudicial actions. And so this is one of the things that led to this notion that perhaps it's not actually measuring the association that we have in our own sort of desires, but rather it is representative of the culture in which we grew up in. And because we're exposed to those associations to such a high degree, those associations become more ingrained in us. A less charged example that I thought was great, that is also in your textbook, is talking about the relationship between, say, bread and butter versus bread and avocado. Most people will be able to very quickly respond that bread and butter are related, but they will do so, it will take them longer, let's say, to respond to bread and avocado. But now, here would be the interesting thing. This whole new thing of avocado toast becoming so popular, and certain places in the world or in the country, let's say, that it has become a common thing, whereas in other places it's not. In those places where it is common, people are much more likely to respond to that association more quickly than to a place where it is not. And this doesn't actually have anything to do with whether or not they would buy an avocado toast if given the option.